Rain had been falling on Budaratari since before midnight, and at 4 in the morning on the 17th of August, 1942, the rubber boats came in on a surf that was heavier than anyone had planned for. 211 Marines had spent the night packed inside two submarines, the Nautilus and the Argonaut, breathing diesel and their own sweat, and most of them came ashore soaked, with outboard motors drowned dead and men paddling by hand across the last 100 yards of a lagoon they could not see. They were the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. Almost none of them had been in combat before. Sergeant Clyde Thompson had. Not much, and not lately. He was 38 years old, a Georgia man out of Atlanta, tall, quiet in a way that other men noticed, and he had already served one enlistment in the Marine Corps and gone home to sell goods for a living before Pearl Harbor pulled him back into uniform. On that beach in that dark, he moved along the line of a company that had never been shot at and got it organized. And when the shooting started, he did the thing that nobody teaches and everybody remembers. He stood up. He stood up where the fire could find him, and he pointed, and he put the volume of his section exactly where it needed to go. Within a few minutes, a Japanese counterattack that should have pinned 200 Americans against the water had come apart at a range of 40 yards. What happened to Sergeant Thompson that morning is not the point yet. What matters is that the men beside him were carrying something that a Japanese rifle section had no answer for inside 25 yards, and the Japanese garrison on Budaratari discovered that fact in less time than it takes to reload. The raid itself changed almost nothing strategically. It was a pinprick. But it was the first time the thing worked, and within 13 months, the tactic that had carried the Japanese army from Malaya to the Solomons without a defeat would be finished as a way of winning battles. It would not be finished by bombers, or by battleships, or by any of the machines the newsreels loved. It would be finished at a distance you could cross in 3 seconds, in the dark, by men who had been given a weapon the United States Army had spent 20 years trying not to buy. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the American infantryman was actually afraid of in 1942, and it was not a tank. In the first 8 months of the Pacific War, the Japanese Army did something no other force in that conflict managed. It won a reputation that beat its enemies before contact. Singapore fell to a force outnumbered roughly 2-1, and it fell in 70 days, and the surrender of 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops was the largest capitulation in British military history. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Hong Kong, Wake, Guam, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. Bicycle infantry moved faster down jungle roads than motorized columns could withdraw along them. American and Commonwealth officers who had assumed that dense terrain was impassable learned that it was only impassable to men who believed it was. The core of it was not equipment. The standard Japanese rifle, the Type 38, fired a 6.5mm cartridge and had been designed in 1905. The Japanese Army had almost no motor transport by Western standards, thin artillery, and a supply system that assumed the soldier would carry rice and take the rest from the enemy. What it had instead was a doctrine built entirely around one moment, closing the last 200 yards at night without being detected and finishing the fight with the bayonet. They were extraordinarily good at it. Night movement was trained relentlessly, and it was trained as an offensive art rather than an emergency measure. Patrols went out to find the seam between two units, and the attack went in at that seam. Infiltration parties crawled through positions and appeared behind them. Officers carried swords not as ornaments, but because the assault was expected to end in reach of one. And when a Japanese company came out of the dark at 50 yards screaming, the defenders had perhaps 8 seconds of useful shooting before the fight became personal. Against troops with bolt-action rifles, 8 seconds was 5 shots per man if he was calm, and men are not calm at 2 in the morning. Positions folded from the inside. Malaya was full of Commonwealth battalions that were never broken by weight of fire, only by the discovery at 3 in the morning that the enemy was already among them. That produced a second weapon, and it was the more dangerous one. It produced belief. By the middle of 1942, American troops arriving in the Pacific had absorbed the idea that the Japanese soldier could see in the dark, that he never surrendered, that the jungle was his home ground and not theirs. Officers heard it in the questions their men asked. Correspondents printed it. It was mostly nonsense, and it was operating on every man in a foxhole at midnight anyway, and the Americans' own doctrine at that moment was quietly getting them killed. The United States Marine Corps that went to war in 1942 had a rifle squad of 8 men. It was built around aimed fire at range. One automatic rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, went to the squad, and it was a superb weapon, 20 rounds, a rifle cartridge that would go through a tree, and it weighed 19 pounds, and there was exactly one of it. Everything else was a rifle designed for a man lying prone, picking a target he could see at 300 yards. The Pacific did not offer 300 yards. It offered 30. In jungle, on a coral ridge at night, in a coconut grove where visibility was measured by the length of a rifle, the entire architecture of American infantry fire, the range estimation, the fire control, the careful conservation of ammunition, was designed for a battlefield that was not there. Several answers had already been tried. The shotgun was one, and Marines had carried them in France and in Nicaragua and would carry them across the Pacific. And inside 15 yards, a trench gun was terrifying. But it held 6, and reloading it under a bayonet charge was a task for a man with 3 hands. The Browning was another, and where a Browning was sighted well, a night attack died in front of it, but it was a position weapon, heavy to shift, and once the attackers were inside the wire it could not be turned fast enough. Grenades were a third. Grenades are indiscriminate at 10 feet, and the men throwing them were in the same 10 feet. What was missing was a weapon that one man could carry all day, could swing like a stick at a moving shape, and could empty into that shape faster than any human being could cross the ground between them. Not accuracy, not range, not penetration. Volume held in one pair of hands and available to every third man in a squad rather than to one man in 8. The Americans had one. They had had one since the last war. Nobody had wanted it. And there was one more thing, which took until the summer of 1942 to be understood properly, because it was hiding in plain sight in every intelligence document about the Japanese army. It was not a secret. It was an absence. Japanese infantry firepower was built around the light machine gun. The Type 96 and the Type 99 were good guns, fed from a top-mounted magazine, and a Japanese platoon leaned on them the way a man leans on a rail. The rest of the squad's weight of fire came from bolt-action rifles and from grenade dischargers, the little tube the Americans called a knee mortar, which was accurate and quick and lethal at 150 yards. What the Japanese army did not have, in any quantity that mattered, was a submachine gun. There was a design, the Type 100, and it worked well enough. It was issued mainly to paratroopers and to naval landing forces, and it appeared in Java and Sumatra and later in the Philippines. Across the entire war, Japan produced them in the tens of thousands at most. The United States produced more than 1.5 million Thompsons. Set that beside the doctrine and the shape of the problem appears. A Japanese assault was engineered to bring the fight to a distance where rifles were clumsy and machine guns could not traverse, and it was carried out by men whose own automatic firepower was tied to a bipod behind them, unable to fire into the melee they had just created. The Japanese army had built the perfect tactic for a close-range fight, and then walked into that fight with the weapons of a long-range one. That was the weakness. Inside 25 yards in the dark, the Japanese rifle section was the least automatic force on the field. The gun that exploited it had been designed by a man who was trying to solve a completely different war, and who had failed to solve it in time. Brigadier General John Taliaferro Thompson was a career Army Ordnance officer, and by 1916 he was a retired one, working in private industry with a fixed idea. The Western Front had settled into trench lines, and he had concluded that what an attacking infantryman needed was not a better rifle, but a device he called a trench broom, something that would sweep a length of trench clear in a few seconds and be carried by one man. He wanted it automatic. He wanted it firing a pistol cartridge, because a pistol cartridge is short, and a short cartridge lets you build a short gun. The engineering came from a naval officer's patent and 2 employees. John Bell Blish had patented a principle of friction adhesion between inclined metal surfaces under pressure, and Thompson bought the rights to it. 2 young engineers, Theodore Eickhoff and Oscar Payne, turned the idea into a weapon that actually functioned, and Payne in particular shaped the thing that men would recognize on sight for the rest of the century: the forward grip, the finned barrel, the drum. The first shipment of production guns reached the docks in New York in November of 1918. The armistice was signed before they left the harbor. The trench broom had missed its trench. What followed is the part of the story that explains why American infantry was not carrying this weapon in December of 1941. Auto Ordnance had Colt build 15,000 of them and could not sell them. The Army was not interested in a weapon that could not shoot past 100 yards. Police departments bought a few. The Marine Corps bought some and took them into Nicaragua and Haiti, where officers fighting in close country at short range wrote reports that were the first honest field assessment the gun ever received, and those reports said it was extremely effective, and nobody outside the Corps read them. Then Chicago happened. The Guns Association with organized crime in the 1920s did more to fix its public image than any military use ever would, and it made the weapon politically radioactive. A gun costing around $200 in an era when a new automobile cost $600, notorious, short-ranged, and rejected by the Army. By the mid-30s, the Thompson was closer to a curiosity than a service weapon. The war rescued it. The British bought it in bulk in 1940. The U.S. Army standardized it. And under wartime pressure, the design was stripped down. The Blish lock, which had never been necessary, was deleted. The drum magazine was dropped in favor of straight box magazines of 20 and 30 rounds. The cocking handle moved to the side. The muzzle compensator and the finned barrel disappeared. The M1 and M1A1 that reached the Pacific were plainer and uglier than the gangster gun, and the price fell from $200 to about $45. Here is what the men who got it actually held. 10.5 pounds empty, which is heavy for its size and heavier at the end of a march. A cartridge, the 45 ACP, that leaves the muzzle slower than the speed of sound and hits like a thrown brick. A rate of fire around 600 or 700 rounds a minute, which means a 30-round magazine is gone in under 3 seconds if you hold the trigger down, and no one held the trigger down for long. And a wooden stock and a solid receiver, which meant that when it ran dry it was still a club, and men used it as one. And there was an advantage nobody wrote into the requirement. The 45 round was subsonic. It did not crack. Rifle fire announces the direction it came from because the bullet breaks the sound barrier over the listener's head, and every soldier learns to read that crack. A Thompson firing at night from inside a tree line produced a heavy hammering noise and muzzle flash, and no supersonic snap to triangulate from. And it was almost always being fired from a position the enemy had already decided was theirs. It was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with ballistics. Men who carried it in the Pacific did not describe it as accurate, and they were right. Beyond about 75 yards, it was a noisemaker. What they said instead, again and again, in unit histories and in letters and in interviews decades later, was that it settled the argument. A rifleman in a night fight had a decision to make about each shot. A man with a Thompson did not have decisions. He had a direction. Which brings us to the idea, because the weapon alone would have changed very little. The man who turned it into a system was a lieutenant colonel named Evans Carlson, and he was, by the standards of the United States Marine Corps in 1942, a genuine oddity. He had enlisted in the Army as a teenager, served in the Philippines, left, come back, joined the Marines, served in Nicaragua, and then spent years in China, first as an observer, Then, in the late 30s, marching with Chinese Communist forces of the 8th Route Army during their war against the Japanese. He watched an army with almost no heavy equipment fight an army that had all of it, and he came home with two convictions that made his superiors uncomfortable. The first was about morale and explanation, that men fight better when they are told why. The second was about the shape of a squad. Carlson's answer when he was given the 2nd Raider Battalion was to break the rifle squad into 3 parts. Not one squad of 8 under one leader, but 10 men, a squad leader and 3 fire teams of 3. And each of those 3-man teams carried, deliberately, 3 different weapons: a Browning automatic rifle, an M1 Garand, and a Thompson submachine gun. Understand what that does, because this is the whole mechanism. The Browning gives the team something that will reach out, punch through a log, and beat down a machine gun at 200 yards. The Garand gives it aimed, self-loading rifle fire in between. And the Thompson gives it a weapon that owns everything from the muzzle out to about 50 yards, the exact band of ground that Japanese doctrine was specifically designed to force the fight into. Each team could fight independently. Each team had an answer at every range, all the time, without waiting for the platoon's machine gun to be dragged into position. Then multiply. A standard Marine rifle squad brought 1 automatic weapon to a night fight. A Carlson squad brought 6, 3 Brownings and 3 Thompsons, in a body of men only 2 larger. Where an 8-man squad had 1 man who could put out sustained fire and 7 who could not, the new squad had a majority who could. The discipline this demanded was harder than the fighting, and this is the part that gets left out. Automatic fire is an ammunition problem. A man who empties magazines because it feels good is a man who is empty when it matters, and in the Pacific resupply might be a working party carrying boxes up a ridge under mortar fire. So the Raiders trained on short bursts, 3 rounds, 5 at most, and on trigger control at a range where the enemy is close enough that panic is the natural response. They trained on fire discipline in darkness, which means holding fire when something moves, because the something might be your own patrol coming back. And they trained to accept a thing that runs against every instinct a defending soldier has, to let the attack come, to hold silent while a Japanese company crossed open ground, and to open at a range where nobody misses. The underlying logic is simple enough to carry away and repeat. The Japanese army had chosen the ground of the last 25 yards. The American answer was not to avoid that ground. It was to arm for it more heavily than the enemy had, and then invite him onto it. The reason the Japanese could not answer had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with structure, and the structure was locked. Start with the tactic itself. Night infiltration only works if it stays undetected until the final rush. That means no preparatory fire, no support that gives away the axis, and a final assault delivered by men who have crawled in with what they can carry. The doctrine had, by design, stripped the assaulting force of the very heavy weapons that might have suppressed a defender at close range. The light machine guns were behind. The mortars were behind. The men who arrived at the wire arrived with rifles, bayonets, and grenades, and every one of those is a one-shot instrument at 3 yards. Then there was the manufacturing decision, which had been made years earlier and could not be unmade in the middle of a war. Japan's small arms industry was already straining to replace the 6.5 mm Type 38 with the 7.7 mm Type 99, and that transition was never completed. Japanese units fought the entire war with 2 incompatible rifle cartridges in circulation. Adding a 3rd production line for a pistol-caliber weapon that doctrine did not consider essential was not a priority when the doctrine said the bayonet closed the fight. And the high command misread what was happening in front of it. Through the second half of 1942, the pattern of reports coming back from the Solomons described attacks that had been stopped short with heavy losses, and the conclusion drawn at the headquarters level was not that the tactic had been answered. It was that the units had lacked resolve, or that the reconnaissance had been poor, or that the assault had gone in with insufficient numbers. So the correction was to send more men, harder, at the same ground. That correction was fatal because of the arithmetic underneath it. The soldiers Japan was feeding into these attacks were, in 1942, largely long-service regulars, men from the China campaigns, with years of training in exactly the night assault skills that were being spent. They were not replaceable at the rate they were being consumed. The men killing them were being produced by a training system that would run millions through it, equipped by an industry that would build 1.5 million of one weapon type alone. The strength was the weakness. The tactic that had made the Japanese army feared required its best troops to walk, on purpose, into the one band of ground where the enemy now had 6 automatic weapons per squad and they had none. Somebody had to prove it worked. That fell to a battalion of men who had volunteered for something they had not been told the details of, and to a sergeant from Atlanta. Clyde Thompson had been a Marine before, from 1934 to 1939, and then he had been a civilian with a job and a life, and after Pearl Harbor he came back in. He was older than the men around him by a decade and a half. Photographs show a large, square-shouldered man with an unhurried expression. In a battalion that Carlson had filled with volunteers screened for endurance, marksmanship, and a willingness to be told nothing about where they were going, Thompson was not the fastest or the youngest. He was the one the platoon watched. There is a small detail about him that has nothing to do with combat, and that survives anyway. Before the war, he had spent time around the film business in California in minor capacities, and among the raiders it was a running item, the sergeant who had been in the movies. It is the kind of thing men keep about each other. It is worth holding on to, because the official record of Clyde Thompson is otherwise 1 page long and made entirely of the last 20 minutes of his life. Carlson's screening for the second raiders was famously severe, and the reason was that he was building a unit around independence. If a 3-man fire team is going to operate on its own initiative in the dark, the corporal leading it has to be able to make a decision that a captain would normally make. That is not a matter of issuing better weapons. That is a matter of picking men, and then convincing them that the picking meant something. Carlson's gung-ho meetings, where enlisted men were told the plan and permitted to argue about it, struck other officers as close to a discipline problem. What they produced was a battalion in which a sergeant would stand up in the open at 4 in the morning and reorganize a fight that had gone wrong, which is exactly what Budaratari required, because almost nothing about the Makin raid went to plan. The surf ruined the landing. The outboards flooded. A rifle discharged by accident and took away the surprise. The garrison, a naval detachment of perhaps 80 to 90 men, reacted fast and well, and it did what Japanese detachments did: it counterattacked into contact. They came at the Marine line twice in the first hours, and the second time they came with everything, including 2 machine guns firing to cover the rush and a flamethrower party. And they came, as doctrine required, all the way in. The Marines had settled along a line among the coconut palms, and Thompson was moving on his feet along that line placing fire. And what met the Japanese charge was the thing Carlson had built. Brownings taking the machine gun positions at range, Garand's in the middle, and Thompson's at 40 yards and then 20 from men lying flat in scrub, delivering into a body of men in the open more rounds in 10 seconds than a bolt-action line could deliver in a minute. The charge broke. It broke again on the second attempt. By the time the fighting on Budaratari ended, the Japanese garrison had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, and it had been destroyed almost entirely at ranges under 100 yards by a body of men who had never fought before. The raiders lost 30 dead. The raid captured documents, destroyed a radio station and stores, and did not achieve one of its stated strategic aims. Militarily, it was a footnote. Tactically, it was the first hard evidence. 211 Americans had received the Japanese nighthand close assault, the technique that had taken Singapore, and had beaten it in the open with squad weapons. A word here, because this is a subject where the popular version is wrong in a specific way, and it takes a real effort to keep it straight. Every claim in this script has been checked against unit records, casualty returns, and production figures rather than the version that circulates in comment sections, where you will constantly read that the Japanese army had no submachine gun at all. It had one, the Type 100, and it was a decent weapon, and it was fielded in numbers too small to matter. That distinction is the difference between a story and the truth. If you want more of the second kind, a like on this video is what tells the algorithm to carry it further. Now turn the thing around and look at it from the other side, because the reaction on the Japanese side is where the shape of this becomes visible. What went back up the chain from the Solomons in the autumn of 1942 was, at first, disbelief. Japanese estimates of American infantry had been formed in the Philippines and had described a force that was well equipped and unwilling to fight at close quarters. That assessment had been reasonable in January. It was catastrophic by September. Captured diaries recovered on Guadalcanal, and there were a great many of them, because Japanese soldiers kept diaries at a rate that made them one of the richest intelligence sources of the war, returned to the same observation from different men in different units. Not the artillery, which they had expected. Not the aircraft. The volume of small arms fire arriving instantly from everywhere along a line at the moment of the final rush. Men wrote about being unable to identify where the fire was coming from. They wrote about attacks that dissolved before the objective was reached. The instructions that came down in response tell you more than the diaries do. Units were told to press attacks with greater dispersion, to attack on narrower frontages, to move in smaller infiltration parties, to rely more heavily on grenade dischargers before the assault. Every one of those adjustments is a concession, an attempt to reduce the number of men standing in the beaten zone at the moment of contact, and every one of them reduced the shock effect that made the tactic work in the first place. There was no instruction that could be issued to fix the real problem, because the real problem was that the men going in did not have automatic weapons in their hands, and there was no way to give them any. And in the after-action reporting there is a tonal shift you can track across the second half of 1942, from an army explaining a temporary setback to an army explaining, repeatedly, why the same method had failed again. It was about to fail on a scale that decided a campaign. Through the autumn, the American side kept escalating. The Raider concept spread. The 1st Raider Battalion under Merritt Edson had already fought on Chilagi in the first hours of the Guadalcanal landings on the 7th of August, clearing caves and holding through a night of Japanese counterattacks at grenade range, and Edson had come out of it with a reputation and a conviction. A 3rd and 4th Raider Battalion formed. The Army was arming its own Ranger battalions along similar lines. And the Thompson was spreading beyond the specialists, to paratroopers, to tank crews, to the point men of ordinary rifle squads, to officers who had discovered that a carbine was not enough. Then, in November, Carlson took the 2nd Raiders on the operation that proved the idea at the operational level rather than the tactical one. He landed at Ayala Bay on the 4th of November and went inland after a Japanese force retreating overland toward the west of Guadalcanal, and he stayed out for 30 days. His men marched something in the region of 150 miles through country the Japanese believed impassable to Americans, fought around a dozen separate actions, lived on rice and tea and what could be airdropped, and hunted a retreating column continuously rather than in set-piece engagements. They reported 488 Japanese killed. 16 Raiders died. That ratio is the fire team doing exactly what it was designed to do. A patrol that meets an enemy detachment on a jungle trail has 3 seconds of contact before somebody wins, and a squad with 3 Thompsons and 3 Brownings in it wins those 3 seconds nearly every time, and then moves on. Carlson's long patrol did not win the campaign, but it demonstrated that the jungle was not the enemy's ground, that Americans could operate inside it for a month, and that Japanese troops in the interior of Guadalcanal were now the ones being hunted. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the mechanics underneath the famous names, the subscribe button is the only thing that decides whether the next one reaches you. And the next section of this story is the one it was all built toward. 2 nights in September, on a bare coral spine 1,000 yards from the airfield, where 840 Americans stood in front of 3,000 men, and the entire Japanese method of night attack was expended against them in a single continuous assault. That ridge had no name in September of 1942. On the maps, it was an unremarkable grass-covered rise running roughly north to south, about 1,000 yards south of Henderson Field, and it was chosen almost by accident. Merritt Edson, who had brought the 1st Raider Battalion through Chilagi, looked at the ground behind the perimeter and concluded that the Japanese would come from the south through the jungle, and that the ridge was the road to the airfield. He asked for permission to put his men on it. The staff thought the southern jungle was too dense for a serious attack. Edson got his permission by describing the move as a rest area for a tired battalion. He had roughly 840 men, the 1st Raiders, worn down and sick, joined by the 1st Parachute Battalion, which had been badly cut up on Gavutu and was operating as infantry. Malaria and dysentery had thinned every company. Against them, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was assembling a brigade of about 3,000, and his plan was pure doctrine executed at scale. A night approach through the jungle, converging attacks on a narrow frontage, and the airfield taken before dawn. The first night, the 12th of September, was a probe that came in after a naval bombardment and pushed the Raiders off part of the southern spur. It was confused, it was expensive on both sides, and it told Edson exactly what he needed to know: the weight was coming, and it was coming up the ridge. Through the daylight of the 13th, his men pulled back onto a tighter perimeter around the northern knoll, dug what they could into coral with entrenching tools, registered artillery from the 11th Marines onto the ground in front of them, and waited. Edson's instruction to the line was simple, and it is the whole doctrine in one sentence: hold fire until they are close. They came at dusk and they came all night. Kawaguchi's battalions attacked in successive waves up the spine and along both flanks, using smoke and flares and screaming, and at points they broke into the perimeter and had to be pushed out by hand. Major Kenneth Bailey, commanding a Raider company, spent the night moving along the line carrying ammunition up personally to positions that had run dry, and at one point stood on the parapet of a machine gun position, dropping grenades onto Japanese soldiers who had reached the foot of it. What the Japanese ran into on that slope was every element of this story arriving at once. Artillery fell on the approach march from batteries that had pre-registered the ground. Machine guns took the open ground at range. And then, at 20 and 30 yards in the dark, along a line of men lying in shallow scrapes in coral, the Thompsons and the Brownings opened. There is no way to make that sound like anything other than what it was. Men who had crossed 1,000 yards of jungle in silence arrived at a crest where the defenders had deliberately let them get close, and were hit by automatic fire from a majority of the rifles in front of them at a range where the muzzle flash lit the man being shot. Waves went in and did not come back. Then the next wave went in over the same ground. Japanese officers led with swords drawn because that was the moment the doctrine had been built for, and the doctrine had no answer for what was waiting at the top. By the small hours, Edson's perimeter had shrunk to a few hundred men on the last knoll. Artillery was being called in at 100 yards and closer. At one stage, the fighting reached the point where the reserve of the reserve, headquarters personnel, engineers, anyone available, was fed into the line. Edson stood through it in the open on the ridge itself, in a position where he could be seen, and his refusal to move backward was the reason a line that had every reason to go did not go. At dawn on the 14th, Kawaguchi's brigade broke off. What was on the slope in front of the American positions was something in the region of 800 dead, and the survivors withdrew west through the jungle with their wounded, abandoning heavy equipment, many of them dying on the march. Edson's force had lost around 80 killed and roughly twice that wounded. The ridge was named for Edson afterward, and the Marines who fought there called it something else, which was Bloody Ridge, and both names are used to this day. The material result was that Henderson Field remained American, which meant the aircraft on it remained, which meant the sea lanes to Guadalcanal stayed contested and eventually stopped being contested at all. That is the strategic sentence, and it is in every account. The other result is the one that mattered longer. On that ridge, the Japanese army committed its signature tactic, at brigade strength, executed competently by good troops under a capable commander, against a defense that was outnumbered nearly 4-1, and it was destroyed by infantry small arms fire at a range of 30 yards. Not by superior numbers, not by technology the Japanese lacked entirely, by a decision about what should be in the hands of the man in the hole. After Bloody Ridge, the belief started to move to the other side of the line. You can see the deterioration in the Japanese record over the following year, and it is not a collapse of courage, which never happened. It is a collapse of expectation. Diaries from late 1942 on Guadalcanal describe hunger first and hopelessness second, and the surviving reports of the units that attacked the Matanikau and the Ridge repeat a theme of attacks that could not be pressed home. The word that recurs in translated documents is not fear. It is the acknowledgement that the objective could not be reached. The attempts at a counter came, and every one of them arrived wrong. Production of the Type 100 submachine gun was increased with a simplified pattern late in the war, and it appeared in quantity nowhere that mattered. Japanese units in Burma and the Philippines began carrying captured Thompsons and captured Garans as prizes, which solves nothing at the scale of an army. Doctrine shifted, and here the change is real and worth stating precisely. By 1944 on Peleliu, and decisively on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese army had largely abandoned the mass night assault in favor of deep defensive positions, reverse slope fighting, caves and tunnels, and a battle of attrition designed to make the Americans come to them. That change was forced. It was the correct adaptation, and it made those campaigns the bloodiest of the Pacific War, and it was also an admission that the offensive method the Army had been built around no longer functioned. Clyde Thompson did not see any of it. He was killed on Budaratari on the 17th of August, 1942, within an hour or so of the action described at the beginning of this account, shot by a Japanese sniper while he was standing to direct the fire of his men. He was 38. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for that morning, and he became the first enlisted Marine of the Second World War to receive it. The citation is short. It describes him disposing his men, exposing himself to fire to locate the enemy and leading an assault, and it ends the way those documents end. Accounts of the raid differ on what he himself was carrying that morning. Some say a shotgun, some say a Thompson, and the honest answer is that the record does not settle it. What is not in dispute is what his section was firing, or that the Japanese counterattack that came at them was stopped in the open. His body was left on Budaratari. The raid withdrew under pressure, in darkness and heavy surf, and 19 Marines were buried by the islanders or by the returning Japanese garrison. 9 raiders were left behind alive by accident, captured, taken to Kwajalein and beheaded. Thompson's grave was unmarked for more than half a century. Evans Carlson's end has its own shape to it. He fought on with the 2nd Raiders, was promoted, and by 1944 was a colonel serving in an observer's role on Saipan, an officer who was not supposed to be in the fight. On the 22nd of June, a battalion runner and radio operator working with him was hit in the open. Carlson went out and carried him back, and was shot through the arm and the thigh doing it. He never recovered his health. He was retired for disability, and he died of heart disease in May of 1947 at 51 years old. The man who had spent the war teaching Marines that the 3-man team was stronger than the individual was destroyed going out alone for one man. Kenneth Bailey, who had spent the night of the 13th carrying ammunition to positions on the ridge, received the Medal of Honor for it and was killed 12 days later, on the 26th of September, in the fighting along the Makin. Behind those names was a system, and the system did the great majority of the killing. The Raiders were disbanded in early 1944. That sounds like a failure, and it was the opposite. Their organization had been absorbed. The Marine Corps rebuilt its rifle squad around the fire team, a 13-man squad with 3 teams, each built around an automatic weapon. And by the time of the Marianas, the elite battalion was unnecessary because every battalion was organized on the same principle. The Thompsons went appoint men and to platoon sergeants and to the men clearing bunkers, and from 1944 they were increasingly replaced by the M3, the stamped steel grease gun, which did the same job worse and cost $20 instead of $45. Nobody who used a Thompson liked the change. The Army made it anyway, because a war is an accounting problem as much as it is anything else. The sequence is worth laying out plainly, because these events happened close together and are often collapsed. February 1942, the 1st and 2nd Raider battalions are formed, and Carlson organizes his around 3-man fire teams. 7th of August, the 1st Raiders take Chilagi in the first hours of the Guadalcanal landings. 17th of August, the Makin raid, and the first clear proof that the close-range fight can be won. 12th to 14th of September, Edson's Ridge, where a Japanese brigade is broken in front of an outnumbered defense. 4th of November to 4th of December, Carlson's long patrol demonstrates the same principle sustained over 30 days. February 1943, Guadalcanal is evacuated by the Japanese. 1944, the fire team becomes standard across the Marine Corps, and the mass night assault largely disappears from Japanese practice. 4 things produce that reversal, and they are not equal. The first is the weapon. A 10-pound gun firing a heavy subsonic pistol round at 600 rounds a minute is not impressive on paper, and was decisive at the only range that Japanese doctrine intended to fight at. It made a single American the fire equivalent of a section for the 3 seconds that decided a night attack. The second is the doctrine, and it is more important than the weapon. The Thompson had existed since 1921. What changed in 1942 was that somebody organized a squad in which the submachine gun, the automatic rifle, and the semi-automatic rifle were held together in one small team that could fight at any range on its own initiative. The gun was an ingredient. The fire team was the answer. The third is reach, the willingness to take that team out into the terrain the enemy considered his own. The long patrol matters because it proved the fire team did not need a prepared position to be lethal. It could go and find people. The fourth is the system standing behind all of it. 1.5 million submachine guns, a training pipeline producing riflemen faster than they could be killed, ammunition delivered in quantities that made a doctrine of automatic fire sustainable, because a squad that fires 6 automatic weapons is worthless if the ammunition arrives by porter twice a week. And on the other side, an army whose best-trained assault infantry were being expended at Bloody Ridge and along the Makin and could not be replaced. Kawaguchi lost something near 800 men in 2 nights, and those were not conscripts. That is the arithmetic that ended the tactic. Now the correction, and it needs stating because the legend has grown past the facts. The Thompson was not the reason the Japanese army lost the Pacific War, and most Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal were killed by artillery, by machine guns, by starvation and disease. The gun itself was flawed in ways the mythology skips, too heavy for its size, poor at penetrating cover and foliage compared with a rifle round, useless beyond about 75 yards, expensive enough that the army replaced it as soon as it had something cheaper. Japanese accounts of the fighting almost never single out one American weapon by name. What they describe is a volume of fire arriving all at once, which is a description of a squad, not of an object. And the fire team idea did not spring from Carlson alone. It had precedents, including German practice, and it was argued over for years. What survives all of that is still substantial. At the range where Japanese doctrine deliberately chose to fight, American infantry became, in the space of a single year, the most heavily automatic infantry in the world, and the submachine gun in a majority of those squads was a Thompson. The dread was real, and it was earned by a system rather than by a gun. The physical remains of it are scattered and specific. In 1999, a recovery team excavated a burial site on Butte Aratari and found the remains of 19 Marine raiders who had been left behind in August of 1942. They were identified and brought home, and in August of 2001 they were buried at Arlington National Cemetery, 59 years after the raid. Clyde Thompson lies in Georgia, at Marietta, where he came from. The ridge outside Henderson Field is still there, grass-covered and unremarkable, and the airfield below it is now the international airport at Honiara, and people land on it every week without knowing what happened on the rise to the south. Japanese veterans of the Solomons who were interviewed decades afterward tended to describe the same two things: the hunger, and the moment the fire came. Several of them said, in different words, that they had been told the enemy would not stand at close quarters. That was the belief that died on the ridge, and it was replaced in the Japanese army by a colder and more accurate one, which is why Iwo Jima and Okinawa were fought from inside the ground. The machine did not last. Thompsons went to depots, to allies, to a war in Korea, and finally to museum cases, and the gun that is instantly recognizable to everyone under 50 is recognizable because of Chicago rather than Guadalcanal. What lasted was the idea underneath it. Open any modern infantry organization, in any army, and you will find a squad divided into small teams built around automatic weapons, expected to act on the judgment of a corporal. That is Carlson's structure, and it began as an argument about how to survive the last 25 yards. That is the principle worth carrying out of this. Firepower does not win a fight by itself. Firepower wins when it is put in the hands of the man who is going to be standing at the closest range, at the worst hour, with nobody left to ask. This channel does the version of these stories that goes back to the unit records and the production numbers rather than the version that gets repeated until it sounds true. And if that is what you came for, subscribing and turning on notifications is what makes sure the next one reaches you instead of getting buried. A like helps it travel. And one question worth arguing about in the comments: if you had been Edson on the 12th of September, looking at a ridge the staff had told you was not worth defending, would you have asked for it, knowing you had 800 sick men and no reserve behind you?